Okay, welcome back to this tutorial series on FIX API for algorithmic trading. In the last video, we talked about FIX pricing connections. We went through messaging sequences, how to establish Logon messaging sequences, and essentially authenticate with a FIX server. We focused on pricing connections there, and today, however, we'll focus on trading connections and describe the key differences between pricing and trading connections, as well as any additional requirements that go into establishing a trading connection. In terms of agenda, we'll go through a quick recap of the typical FIX authentication sequence, followed by discussing the differences between FIX pricing and trading connections. These include an additional requirement over and above what we discussed in the previous tutorial. Those requirements including the SenderCompID, TargetCompID, username, password, host, and port. In FIX trading connections, there is an additional requirement for account ID that goes into certain messaging types. We'll discuss that, as well as sequence persistence, something that wasn't required in FIX pricing connections. We'll continue from there on to SSL connectivity, as that is required for establishing FIX trading connections. We'll go through how to configure your application to do so, to connect via SSL to the FIX server, as well as tunneling software in order to establish that conduit, that tunnel, literally between your application and the FIX server via SSL. And finally, we'll conclude with future tutorials, what they'll contain, and how we're going to progress from this tutorial onwards. So without further ado, let's go through our quick recap of what we covered in the FIX pricing as well as message sequence tutorial that we did recently. And that essentially described what a FIX message is composed of. It is a sequence of tag value pairs, as we talked about then, each pair being delimited by an ASCII start of header control character. Tags used must not appear more than once, except in repeating groups. This is something we'll cover in future tutorials as well. We then went on to look at some example Logon sequences, an example Logon 35 equals a message, where we basically put together what exactly is required in terms of authentication credentials, such as SenderCompID, TargetCompID, username and password. We described how to calculate the body length and checksum. We then basically did a little overview of what a sequence looks like. A client sends a 35 equals a message to the FIX server to initiate a logon sequence. If all the credentials are correct and everything is valid as regards the message that was sent to the FIX server, then the FIX server responds with its own logon message, completing the transaction and authenticating the user. So with that, we've wrapped up our recap, and we can proceed to what we are discussing today in terms of the differences between pricing and trading connections, what's entailed, any additional parameters that are required, and we'll go into SSL connectivity and how to achieve that between your FIX application and the FIX server, specifically for trading connections. So these differences essentially center around SSL. In pricing, no SSL. In pricing connections, no SSL is required, and pricing connections must reset sequence numbers on logon. This is what we discussed earlier in the previous tutorial with the reset secnum flag that has to be set to Y in order for the connection to be valid. With trading connections, however, SSL is required, and at the present time, SSL version 2 and 3 and TLS version 1 and 1.1 are supported for these types of connections. In addition to the SenderCompID, TargetCompID, username, password, host, and port combination that we discussed as being required to establish pricing connections, all of those things are required for establishing a trading connection. And for the actual connection, the logon handshake, nothing more is required than the same parameters as for pricing. However, with trading connections, the objective being to transact in terms of orders, order execution requires one additional parameter that is provided to you when you create an account at Darwinex, an account ID. And this account ID is required for order execution, specifically for 35 equals D messages, for new order single messages. Trading connections, in addition to that, must persist sequence numbers on logon, as opposed to pricing, where you can set the reset secnum flag to Y. In the case of trading connections, you need to set the reset secnum flag to N, as message persistence is mandatory for establishing the connection. Moving on from there to actually establishing the SSL connectivity and what's required, let's discuss the steps you need to take to configure your FIX application in order to do that. Firstly, as we discussed just now, set tag 141, which is the reset secnum flag, to N, as message persistence is mandatory. Secondly, now these two parameters, socket connect host and socket connect port, are specific naming conventions to quick fix. This essentially is referring to the host you're connecting to and the port. So these things may differ depending on the engine you're using. Instead of specifying the fix server's host as you did with the pricing connections, as well as the fix server port, we will specify, in our case, for this example, the local host IP address, which is 127.0.0.1, and port 443. In this case, since we're establishing a connection to the local SSL tunnel that I'll go on to describe shortly what that is, why that's required. And this configuration is essentially something that will be done by you in your SSL tunneling software, something we'll go into shortly. What we're doing here is, because our application cannot connect to the fixed server via SSL on its own, we need a mechanism for establishing that SSL connection. In order for us to do that, we need some sort of tunneling software, and the most popular in that department is the open source S-Tunnel software, which you can visit www.stunnel.org. And this application is essentially a proxy that is designed to add SSL and TLS encryption to existing applications without the need to change any application code. So if we think about it in that context, what we're essentially doing is we have this application that is sitting on a certain port that it's configured to listen on, that in this example being port 443. You can configure this to any other port of your choice, as we'll go on to describe shortly. And instead of our fix application connecting directly to the fix server, we're going to have it connect to this tunneling software on the local host that will then route the connection via SSL to the fix server and be the middleman, the bridge between our application and the fix server. This will then establish an SSL tunnel between our fix application and the fix server that requires SSL connectivity as a mandatory requirement for establishing a trading connection. In order for us to do so, we need to make these changes as we've discussed so far. If, for instance, you're using quick fix, then configuration files will require these four parameters in particular to be changed, as we've discussed in this tutorial, meaning reset on logon and reset secnum flag being set to N, and the socket connect host and socket connect port being set to 127.0.0.1 and 443 respectively for this example. As I'll show you shortly, how you configure your S-Tunnel configuration file will determine these values. So 443 and 127 are simply example IP address and port configuration parameters that we've chosen for this tutorial. Once you've downloaded and installed S-Tunnel, launching the GUI will lead to a screen such as the one on the top right of this screen. You'll see four tabs at the top: File, Configuration, Save Peer Certificate, and Help. If you click on the configuration menu and then click Edit Configuration, this will launch your default text editor. In most Windows systems, that is the default notepad. And once that's launched, you need to add the following lines to your stunnel.conf file. Here again, the naming conventions are purely for the purposes of this tutorial. So when you see in the configuration below, fix_localhost_2_Darwinex server, this is purely an example. You can have anything, fix1, fix2, whatever you'd like to call it, that's irrelevant. What's relevant are the parameters below the first line and the values you put in them, because it's these values that A, need to be correctly specified, and B, need to be in your fix application configuration in order for the tunnel to be established successfully. Client equals yes, as your fix application is the client application connecting to the fix server. Except equals 127.0.0.1:443 in this example. Here is where you can change these parameters to suit whatever configuration you'd like. But for this example, and the default norm is to choose 443 for SSL. However, if you have any other reason for choosing a different port configuration, you can do that over here. Connect equals server host name or IP, :server port. This is where you specify the fix server's hostname or IP address, followed by the fix server's port for the trading connection, details of which you'll have been provided by Darwinex once you've logged in and created your account and received your fix connector details. Now, this information is specific to the trading connection. Remember that SenderCompID, TargetCompID, username, password. These 4 main credentials that are common to both pricing and trading connections have different values for pricing connections and trading connections. So it's important to make sure that you've copied over the correct values from the configuration that's provided to you by Darwinex staff. And finally, your configuration here is complete after specifying these 4 lines. The first line being a name for the connection you'd like to establish, client equals yes, accept equals host and port that you'd like your application to connect to, and connect equals the FIX server's hostname or IP address and its port. And that's it. That's your S-tunnel configuration complete for the purposes of this FIX application. All you need to then do is save the file, close the file, and under the same configuration menu, hit reload configuration. That should get everything to load up correctly, and you will see those messages displayed in the S-tunnel log on the top right of the screen, as you can see on the top right of this screen. A few other notes to this effect. Using S-tunnel in client mode does not require presenting a valid SSL certificate for establishing a connection to the FIX trading server. So there is a default PEM file that ships with S-tunnel. You needn't worry about that because presenting an SSL certificate for the purposes of connecting to the FIX server is not necessary. Secondly, you'll need a valid static IP address in order to establish a FIX trading connection. At the present time, dynamic IP addresses are not permitted in order to establish a FIX trading connection. There are certain operational configuration considerations that go into play when deciding this, and therefore at the present time, should you wish to create a FIX trading connection to a Darwinex FIX server, you'll need a static IP address that is required to have been registered already with the FIX server prior to you initiating the connection. So if you have a dynamic IP address that's prone to changing and the static IP address is what's configured at the FIX server, your connection will be denied. Therefore, it's important that you have a valid static fixed IP address in order to initiate the connection. And that's pretty much it. That's your SSL connectivity. Those are your SSL connectivity requirements for establishing a FIX trading connection. And the key differences, as we've discussed today, being that A, you need to connect via SSL, and B, you need an account ID if you're going to send any order-related instructions. As always, if you enjoyed this presentation, please do consider sharing it with your social networks, colleagues, co-workers, and friends. And do subscribe to the Darwinex YouTube channel so you remain up to date with all future videos that will be released in this series and other topics discussed on Darwinex. Thank you very much for your attention. See you next time.